There's a haunting image at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, a Spanish galleon. Her timbers rotted away, surrounded by thousands of silver coins scattered across the ocean floor. No one can spend them. No one even wants them. They're just metal now, divorced from the meaning they once carried. This image captures one of history's most instructive paradoxes: how the richest empire the world had ever known managed to declare bankruptcy. Not once, not twice, but 9 times over a span of just 150 years. Spain controlled more wealth than any previous civilization, yet couldn't pay its bills. Understanding why requires us to examine something more fundamental than economics: the psychology of abundance, the institutional forces that shape how societies make decisions, and the dangerous cognitive traps that await any civilization convinced of its own permanence. To grasp this paradox, we need to return to a single year that still echoes through history: 1492. Most people know it as the year Columbus sailed. But that voyage was merely one of 3 simultaneous events that would define Spain's trajectory for centuries. Each created opportunity. Each also planted the seeds of institutional dysfunction that would eventually hollow out an empire from within. The first event was the completion of the Reconquista. After 781 years of intermittent warfare, Christian kingdoms had finally expelled the last Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. Think about that duration. Families had fought this campaign for 30 generations. Victory wasn't just a military achievement, it was the defining narrative of Spanish identity. But here's where psychology enters the story. When a society achieves something after centuries of struggle, it develops what behavioral economists call victory bias, the assumption that strategies successful in one domain will work in entirely different contexts. Spain had become extraordinarily good at warfare, at religious fervor, at military organization. These capabilities had delivered the peninsula. Spanish elites naturally assumed the same mindset would serve them in governing an empire, in managing an economy, in competing with rivals who operated under entirely different rules. The second event that year was Columbus's voyage, which would eventually open access to New World riches beyond European imagination. But the third event receives less attention, despite its devastating long-term consequences. In that same year, 1492, Spain's rulers expelled the entire Jewish population and forced Muslims to convert or leave. These communities had served as the peninsula's merchant class, its financiers, its administrative experts, the people who understood trade networks, credit systems, and economic management. In a single policy decision, Spain removed much of its financial expertise precisely when it was about to encounter wealth on an unprecedented scale. Imagine inheriting a vast fortune while simultaneously firing everyone who knows how to manage money. This wasn't just a moral catastrophe, it was an institutional one. The Spanish nobility, the hidalgos, operated under a medieval honor code that viewed commerce with suspicion. Manual labor, trade, even certain forms of productive work were considered beneath the dignity of a nobleman. Status came from land ownership, military service, religious devotion, not from the grubby business of buying and selling. This cultural framework had developed over centuries of feudal warfare. It made perfect sense in that context, but it left Spain structurally unprepared for what was about to happen. By 1545, Spanish conquistadors had discovered Potosi, a mountain in present-day Bolivia that was essentially made of silver. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Over the next century, Potosi would produce more than half the world's silver, fundamentally altering global trade patterns and monetary systems. Ships carrying tons of precious metal began arriving at Seville with astonishing regularity. Spain's annual revenue multiplied. The crown suddenly had access to what seemed like unlimited wealth. Here's where we encounter one of the most consistent patterns in economic history. Windfall gains distort incentives. When wealth arrives through discovery rather than production, when it flows from extraction rather than creation, societies develop different relationships with money. Psychologically, earned income and unearned income feel different. We treat them differently. Research in behavioral economics shows that people are far more likely to spend or waste money they have worked for. The technical term is house money effect, and it operates at the scale of civilizations just as it does in individual psychology. Spain's silver created the illusion of endless resources. Why invest in developing domestic industries when you can import whatever you need? Why cultivate efficient agriculture when foreign grain is available? Why build a merchant marine when Genoese and German bankers will handle your finances? The rational choice in the short term, repeated thousands of times across decades, created an economy structured around consumption rather than production. This is the easy money trap, and Spain walked into it with eyes wide open. In 1556, Charles V abdicated, dividing his vast holdings between his brother and his son. Philip II inherited Spain, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, and the entire New World Empire domain spanning the globe. He also inherited debts totaling 36 million ducats, roughly 7 times Spain's annual revenue. Think about that ratio. It would be like inheriting a business with revenues of $100,000 and debts of $700,000. You're insolvent from day one. But Philip had access to those silver fleets. He had collateral. He could borrow, and borrow he did. Philip's reign perfectly illustrates how institutional dysfunction and ideological rigidity can squander. Unlimited resources, he faced simultaneous conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, rebellious Dutch provinces, France, and eventually England. Maintaining armies and navies across multiple fronts required staggering sums. But here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't defensive wars. Philip was fighting to expand Spanish influence, to suppress Protestantism, to assert Habsburg prestige. The conflicts were ideological, driven by Counter-Reformation, fervor, and dynastic ambition rather than existential necessity. This is where we see the sunk cost fallacy operating at imperial scale. Philip kept escalating commitments to failing ventures because he'd already invested so much. The Dutch Revolt is the clearest example. It began in 1568, it would continue for 80 years. Spain poured blood and treasure into suppressing provinces that were becoming increasingly ungovernable, increasingly expensive, increasingly pointless to hold. But admitting failure would mean accepting that previous investments were wasted. So Spain kept fighting, kept spending, kept borrowing. To fund these wars, Philip relied on a system called the Estado Genoese, and German banking families would provide short-term loans at interest rates between 40 and 50%. Read that again, 40 to 50%. These weren't normal commercial rates. They reflected enormous risk, because everyone involved knew Spain's finances were precarious. But the bankers kept lending because they had leverage over future silver shipments, and Philip kept borrowing because he had no alternative revenue sources. His tax base was narrow, his economy was weakening, and his ideological commitments were non-negotiable. The structure of Spanish taxation reveals much about why the empire struggled despite its wealth. Spain's tax system was fragmented across different kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Valencia, Catalonia, with different privileges and obligations negotiated centuries earlier. Castile bore the overwhelming majority of the tax burden, while other regions contributed relatively little. The nobility and clergy were largely exempt from taxation. This meant the weight fell primarily on Castilian peasants and a small merchant class, precisely the groups least able to bear it and most important for economic productivity. Compare this to England, where Parliament's power of the purse meant taxation required negotiation and consent, creating accountability between rulers and ruled. Or to the Dutch Republic, where tax burdens were distributed more broadly and predictably. Spain's system was extractive rather than consensual, arbitrary rather than rule-based. It couldn't scale to meet imperial ambitions because it lacked the institutional foundation for sustainable revenue. Here's where it gets truly remarkable. Philip declared bankruptcy 4 times during his reign in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. But these weren't bankruptcies in the modern sense. They were negotiating tactics. Spain would suspend payments, restructure debts at lower interest rates, and then immediately start borrowing again. This was sovereign debt restructuring before the term existed, a kind of financial innovation born from desperation. The bankers would howl, threaten, negotiate, and then ultimately accept reduced terms because the alternative was total loss. Let's look closely at how one of these bankruptcies actually worked. In 1575, Spain suspended payments on debts totaling 14 million ducats. The Genoese bankers, who held most of these obligations, were initially devastated. Some faced ruin. But after months of negotiation, they accepted a restructuring that converted short-term high-interest Asian toes into long-term bonds called juros, with much lower interest rates. Why would they agree to this? Because juros were backed by specific tax revenues, primarily from Castile and the Indies. The bankers got certainty over time rather than high returns immediately. And crucially, they maintained their relationship with the Spanish crown, positioning them for future lending once the immediate crisis passed. Within 2 years, Spain was borrowing again, at rates almost as high as before. The system had reset, but nothing fundamental had changed. This system created moral hazard on both sides. Spain learned it could borrow irresponsibly because bankruptcy was survivable. Lenders learned they could charge usurious rates because they'd always get something back. Both parties were trapped in a destructive codependency, each enabling the other's worst behavior. Modern economists studying sovereign debt crises see the same patterns. Creditors who continue lending to obviously insolvent borrowers, periodic restructurings that provide temporary relief without addressing underlying fiscal problems, and the perverse incentive structure where both parties prefer to extend and pretend rather than face reality. Meanwhile, something fascinating was happening in those rebellious Dutch provinces. Philip was bleeding himself dry to suppress. By the late 1500s, Amsterdam had become Europe's financial center. The Dutch had created the first modern stock exchange, pioneered new forms of credit and insurance, and built a merchant empire that would eventually eclipse Spain's, despite having a fraction of the territory and zero natural resources. The Dutch story deserves closer attention because it demonstrates what Spain could have become with different institutional choices. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, was the world's first publicly traded corporation. Citizens could buy shares and participate in the profits of trade voyages. This distributed risk while concentrating capital for large ventures. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, established in 1609, provided reliable currency, exchange, and clearing services, reducing transaction costs and enabling more complex commercial operations. Dutch innovations in bills of exchange, marine insurance, and futures contracts created a sophisticated financial infrastructure that made Amsterdam the place where European and global trade was financed. But the financial innovations were downstream of something more fundamental: institutional trust. Dutch courts reliably enforced contracts. Property rights were secure. Taxation, while substantial, was predictable and approved through representative assemblies. Bankruptcy laws allowed failed merchants to restart rather than face lifelong punishment. These may sound like technical details, but they created an environment where people were willing to take entrepreneurial risks, where capital could find productive uses, where long-term investment made sense. Spain had none of this institutional foundation. Contracts were enforced arbitrarily depending on political favor. Property could be confiscated at royal whim. Taxation was unpredictable. The entire system encouraged short-term extraction rather than long-term investment. The contrast is instructive. Spanish absolutism concentrated power in the crown, which made decisions based on dynastic and religious priorities. Dutch republicanism distributed power among merchant oligarchs, whose wealth depended on trade and property rights. Spanish culture viewed commerce with suspicion. Dutch culture celebrated it. Spain's tax system was extractive and arbitrary. The Dutch system was consensual and predictable. These institutional differences, not geography, not resources, not even culture, in some abstract sense determined which society would thrive. What the Dutch understood, and Spain didn't, was that property rights and rule of law matter more than natural resources. You can have all the silver in the world, but if merchants don't trust that contracts will be honored, if investors can't predict tax burdens, if innovators fear arbitrary confiscation, then capital flows elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened. By the early 1600s, Spanish capital was financing Dutch enterprises. The empire's own wealth was funding its enemies. While Philip's wars raged, something else was happening that would prove even more destructive: the price revolution. Between 1550 and 1650, prices across Europe roughly quintupled. This wasn't a local phenomenon, it was continent-wide inflation driven by a massive increase in money supply. Spain's silver, distributed through trade networks, was fundamentally altering monetary conditions everywhere. Jean Baudin, a French philosopher, was among the first to recognize what was happening. He articulated an early version of quantity theory of money. Too much currency chasing too few goods drives prices up. It seems obvious now, But this was revolutionary thinking in an era when most people viewed money itself as wealth rather than a medium of exchange representing productive capacity. For Spain, this inflation was uniquely destructive because Spain was both the source and the primary victim. Here's how it worked. Silver arrives in Seville, increasing Spain's money supply. Prices in Spain rise faster than elsewhere. Spanish goods become expensive relative to foreign alternatives. Imports flood in because they're cheaper. Spanish industries can't compete. Production shifts abroad. Spain becomes dependent on imports for basic goods. More silver flows out to pay for these imports. The cycle repeats. Let's trace this mechanism through a specific example. Spanish textile production had been significant in the late 1500s, particularly in cities like Segovia and Toledo. These cities had developed expertise in wool processing and cloth manufacturing over generations. But, as silver-driven inflation raised Spanish wages and costs, textiles from the Netherlands and England became cheaper by comparison. Spanish merchants found they could import cloth more affordably than producing it domestically. Textile workshops closed. Skilled workers emigrated or shifted to other occupations. Within a few decades, Spain was importing most of its textiles despite having substantial domestic wool production from its merino sheep flocks. The raw material was exported, processed abroad, and imported back as finished goods. Spain was becoming a peripheral economy even while sitting at the center of a global empire. This is the phenomenon modern economists call Dutch disease, named after problems Netherlands experienced with North Sea oil revenues. When a country has abundant natural resources, especially resources that don't require sophisticated industrial capacity, the currency tends to become overvalued. This makes other sectors of the economy uncompetitive internationally. Manufacturing declines, the economy hollows out, becoming dependent on a single commodity. The term is recent, but the pattern is ancient. For Spain, the effects were devastating. The Castilian textile industry, once substantial, collapsed. Agriculture declined despite the majority of the population working the land. Spain was importing grain, importing manufactured goods, importing nearly everything while sitting atop the world's largest silver reserves. The paradox of plenty had taken hold abundance in one resource, creating scarcity in everything else. But here's what makes this more than just an economic story. Spain couldn't adapt. Other European nations, watching this unfold, implemented protective tariffs and navigation acts. England, for instance, required certain goods to be carried on English ships, creating demand for domestic shipbuilding and merchant marines. These weren't perfect policies, but they reflected governmental awareness that domestic productive capacity mattered. Spain, by contrast, maintained policies designed for a different era. The Hidalgo culture still disdained commerce. The administrative apparatus still prioritized military glory over economic management. Institutions, once formed, are extraordinarily difficult to reform, especially when powerful interests benefit from existing arrangements. There's a psychological dimension to this institutional inertia, worth exploring. Organizations and societies develop what scholars call institutional memory, shared assumptions about how things work and what strategies succeed. Spain's institutional memory was shaped by the Reconquista and early imperial expansion. Military conquest had delivered wealth and territory. Religious fervor had unified the kingdom. Aristocratic values had provided social order. These strategies had worked for centuries. When they stopped working in the changed context of the 16th and 17th centuries, people didn't immediately recognize the shift. They assumed temporary setbacks rather than fundamental change. And the longer they persisted with failing strategies, the more invested they became in justifying those strategies. This is cognitive dissonance at a civilizational scale. The psychological discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs leads people to reject evidence rather than update their worldview. Between 1600 and 1650, Spain's population declined from 8.5 million to 7 million. Some of this was emigration to the New World. But much was demographic collapse driven by economic decline and recurring plague epidemics. The social fabric was unraveling. Picaresque literature emerged in this period, stories of rogues and beggars navigating a world of poverty amid ostentatious wealth. These weren't just entertaining tales. They were social commentary on a civilization eating itself. In 1609, Spain expelled the Moriscos, descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity, but remained suspect in the eyes of old Christian elites. This removed approximately 300,000 people, many of whom were skilled farmers and craftsmen. The economic impact was immediate and severe, particularly in Valencia and Aragon, where Moriscos formed substantial portions of the productive population. But the decision wasn't economic hit, was ideological, driven by religious purity concerns and scapegoating impulses that always intensify during periods of decline. The Morisco expulsion reveals the interaction between economic stress and social psychology. In Valencia, Moriscos constituted nearly one-third of the population and dominated certain agricultural sectors, particularly rice cultivation and irrigation system maintenance. Their expulsion left fields unworked and irrigation channels unmaintained. Landowners who had previously profited from Morisco labor found their estates suddenly unprofitable. Agricultural output plummeted. The rational response would have been to reverse the policy or find ways to attract replacement workers. Instead, Spanish elites doubled down on religious justification, arguing that spiritual purity mattered more than material prosperity. This is rationalization, the psychological process of constructing plausible-sounding justifications for decisions made on other grounds. There's a psychological pattern here worth noting. When societies experience economic stress, there's a powerful tendency to blame outsiders, to see cultural or religious minorities as the source of problems rather than addressing systemic dysfunctions. It's cognitively simpler to identify a scapegoat than to acknowledge that your entire institutional framework is failing. Spain chose the simple explanation repeatedly. First Jews, then conversos, converted Jews suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, then each expulsion provided temporary psychological relief, a sense of decisive action, of purifying the nation, of addressing problems, but each actually weakened the economic foundation while leaving the fundamental institutional dysfunctions untouched. As Spain's economy hollowed out, its culture produced Don Quixote. Cervantes published the first part in 1605, and it became an immediate sensation. The novel tells the story of an aging nobleman so consumed by chivalric romances that he believes himself a knight-errant, destined for glorious adventures. He charges at windmills, thinking they're giants. He interprets inns as castles. The modern world keeps intruding on his delusions, but he cannot or will not see reality clearly. It's difficult to imagine a more perfect metaphor for Spain itself, a society clinging to medieval fantasies while the future was being built elsewhere. By 1621, when Philip IV took the throne, Spain was definitively in decline, though the empire's sheer momentum would sustain appearances for decades more. The new king's chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, understood the depth of the crisis. He attempted reforms streamlining administration, reducing corruption, distributing tax burdens more equitably across Spanish territories. But every reform threatened entrenched interests. The nobility resisted changes that would reduce their privileges. Different kingdoms within the empire resisted centralization. The church resisted any diminishment of its authority, and the empire was still fighting wars it couldn't afford. Olivares represents one of history's tragic figures, capable administrator who understood what needed to change but could overcome the institutional and political obstacles to reform. His most ambitious project was the Union of Arms, a proposal to distribute military obligations more evenly across all Spanish territories rather than relying almost exclusively on Castile. The logic was impeccable. If Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, and other kingdoms benefited from imperial protection, they should contribute proportionally to imperial defense. But the proposal ignited fierce resistance. Each region claimed special privileges, historical exemptions, constitutional protections. Catalonia eventually revolted in 1640 rather than accept increased obligations. Portugal, forced into union with Spain since 1580, seized the moment to declare independence in 1640 and successfully maintained it. Olivares' attempt at rational reform triggered the empire's fragmentation. This episode illustrates why institutional reform is so difficult, even when everyone can see the system is failing. Reform requires coordination. Multiple parties must accept short-term costs for long-term collective benefit. But without credible commitment mechanisms, each party has incentive to defect, to resist bearing their share of costs while hoping others will shoulder the burden. This is the collective action problem, and it destroys societies that can't solve it. Spain couldn't solve it. The empire fragmented not, despite everyone understanding the crisis, but because that understanding could overcome the incentive structure pushing toward fragmentation. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, represented Spain's final major attempt to shape European politics through military force. It was catastrophically expensive and ultimately futile. Spain declared bankruptcy again in 1627, again in 1647, again in 1653, and finally in 1680. By this point, bankruptcy was almost routine periodic accounting adjustment rather than a crisis. This raises a fascinating question. Why did reforms fail, even when reformers understood what needed to change? The answer lies in institutional path dependency. When systems evolve over long periods, they create structures of incentives, norms, and power relationships that are extremely difficult to alter. Elites who benefit from existing arrangements will resist change even when the overall system is failing. And crucially, people can't easily imagine alternatives to systems they've lived with their entire lives. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War and formally recognized Dutch independence after 80 years of conflict. Spain had finally admitted what had been obvious for decades. It couldn't suppress the rebellious provinces. But this wasn't a strategic pivot. Towards sustainability, it was exhausted acknowledgement of reality. Spain's silver fleets were diminishing as mines depleted and English and Dutch privateers grew bolder. The financial machinery was breaking down. And then there was Carlos II, who became king in 1665 at the age of 4. Carlos was the final tragic consequence of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. He was physically and mentally disabled, unable to govern, unable to produce an heir. His very existence seemed to embody the genetic and institutional decay of the dynasty. When he died in 1700 without descendants, his death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a European-wide conflict over who would inherit Spain's still vast territorial holdings. The Carlos II situation deserves reflection because it reveals how dynasticism itself became a vulnerability. The Habsburg strategy of intermarriage among cousin branches was designed to keep power within the family, to prevent territorial fragmentation through inheritance by outsiders. For generations, this worked as intended. But the genetic consequences of repeated close relative marriages accumulated over time. Carlos II's parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides were closely related. The coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic similarity due to ancestry, was extraordinarily high. The physical and cognitive effects were severe. Carlos could barely walk, could barely speak clearly, suffered chronic illness. He was intelligent enough to understand his own incapacity, which must have been its own form of torture. But the deeper problem was structural. The dynasty had prioritized bloodline purity over capability. There was no mechanism for removing an incapable ruler or replacing him with a more competent alternative outside the family line. The entire system was locked into hereditary succession regardless of fitness. This is institutional rigidity at its most literal. The form of governance matters more than the function. Modern constitutional monarchies solved this by separating symbolic rule from actual governance, allowing competent ministers to govern while monarchs perform ceremonial roles. 17th century Spain had no such separation. The incompetent monarch was also the chief executive, the military commander, the source of all governmental authority. System and symbol were fused, making adaptation impossible. The Bourbon dynasty that eventually took control implemented significant reforms. They rationalized administration, encouraged industry, and attempted to modernize Spanish institutions. But by 1700, the damage was too deep and the world had moved on. Spain would never again be a first-rank power. The empire persisted in various forms until the 19th century, but it was living on past glory, not present capability. What can we learn from this cautionary tale? The most obvious lesson is about resource curses. Modern economic research has extensively documented how natural resource wealth often correlates with slower economic growth, weaker institutions, and more authoritarian governance. Venezuela sits atop massive oil reserves, yet experienced hyperinflation and economic collapse. Saudi Arabia's economy remains dangerously dependent on petroleum, despite decades of diversification efforts. Russia's political economy is fundamentally shaped by energy exports. The pattern repeats because resource wealth creates similar incentive structures. Elites capture the gains. Productive sectors atrophy, institutions weaken. The mechanism is well understood now. Resource wealth allows governments to function without broad-based taxation. Without taxation, there's less pressure for political representation or accountability. The social contract between rulers and ruled weakens. Government revenue comes from extracting commodities rather than taxing productive citizens, so government has less incentive to create conditions for broad-based prosperity. Instead, politics becomes competition over resource. Rents who controls the wealth flows. This creates what economists call rent-seeking behavior, where energy goes into capturing existing wealth rather than creating new wealth. Meanwhile, the resource sector enriches elites, while the currency appreciation makes other sectors uncompetitive. Manufacturing jobs disappear. The economy becomes dependent on commodity prices set by global markets beyond local control. When prices fall, there's no productive economy to fall back on. Spain pioneered this pattern. The silver wasn't Spain's doom resource. Curses aren't deterministic. Norway has managed oil wealth well through sovereign wealth funds, transparent governance, and conscious institutional design. Botswana has managed diamond wealth better than most resource-rich nations through relatively accountable institutions. The resource curse is better understood as an institutional choice. Spain poorly chose aristocratic privilege over merchant development, chose religious purity over diversity, chose military glory over economic foundation. These were choices, not inevitable, but there's a deeper psychological dimension. Windfall gains affect how we think about wealth itself. When money arrives through extraction rather than production, societies develop what economists call a rentier mentality, the expectation of income without corresponding effort. This isn't moral judgment. It's description of how incentive structures shape behavior. If you can earn money by controlling a resource, why engage in the harder work of building industries, educating populations, or fostering innovation? Spain's tragedy also demonstrates the power of institutional quality. The country had every material advantage: geography, resources, population, technology, squandered them through dysfunctional institutions. The Dutch had almost nothing: a collection of swampy provinces, vulnerable to flooding, yet built one of history's most successful economies through property rights, rule of law, and political accountability. This asymmetry reveals something fundamental. Institutions matter more than endowments. This is perhaps the single most important lesson from comparative economic history. Natural resources, geographic position, even cultural factors matter far less than the quality of institutions, the formal and informal rules that structure economic activity. Do property rights exist, and are they enforced? Can entrepreneurs trust that contracts will be honored? Is taxation predictable enough to allow long-term planning? Do courts operate fairly regardless of political connections? Can citizens challenge governmental overreach? These aren't abstract concerns, they're the foundation of sustained prosperity. Spain had weak institutions despite strong material foundations. Property could be confiscated at royal discretion. Contracts were enforced based on political favor. Taxation was arbitrary and unequal. Courts served royal prerogative rather than impartial justice. The predictable result was that rational actors avoided long-term investments, hid wealth from taxation, sought political connections rather than productive excellence, and generally behaved in ways that made individual sense but collective failure inevitable. The Dutch created the opposite institutional environment, and the results speak for themselves. By 1700, Amsterdam was Europe's financial capital, while Madrid struggled to pay its bureaucracy. There's also a lesson about status quo bias in declining powers. Spanish elites in 1650 could see their economy failing. They could see Dutch and English prosperity. They could see that their institutional framework wasn't working. But accepting this fully would require acknowledging that the previous century of policy had been catastrophic, that their cultural values were economically dysfunctional, that the entire social order needed restructuring. That's psychologically almost impossible, especially for people whose status derives from existing arrangements. So they kept believing that one more war, one more silver fleet, one more loan would turn things around. The cognitive bias at work here is called the availability heuristic. Predict future outcomes based on recent experience. Spain had been successful. Spanish elites remembered when Habsburg power dominated Europe. That memory, that availability of past success in their minds, made it nearly impossible to accept that the trajectory had fundamentally shifted. We see this pattern in all declining powers. British elites in the early 20th century, American foreign policy debates today, recent success becomes a cognitive trap that prevents adaptation to changed circumstances. There's also a phenomenon psychologists call escalation of commitment, or sunk cost fallacy at work. Spain had invested enormous resources, blood, treasure, prestige in its imperial project. Walking away from the Netherlands, making peace with England, accepting religious diversity, restructuring the tax system, all of these would require admitting that previous investments were wasted. Humans have powerful psychological resistance to such admissions. We prefer to continue failing strategies rather than acknowledge we were wrong. At the individual level, this keeps gamblers at the table after devastating losses. At the civilizational level, it keeps empires fighting unwinnable wars. Spain demonstrated both patterns repeatedly throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Each bankruptcy should have prompted fundamental reassessment. Instead, it prompted temporary adjustment, followed by return to the same failing strategies. Spain's collapse also offers insights into debt, sustainability, and the limits of financial engineering. For a while, Spain's serial bankruptcies worked as a strategy. The empire kept functioning, kept borrowing, kept restructuring. But fundamentally, you cannot indefinitely borrow more than you produce. Eventually, creditors lose faith. Eventually, the gap between obligations and capacity becomes unbridgeable. Modern sovereign debt crises follow remarkably similar patterns: mounting obligations, optimistic assumptions about future growth, periodic restructurings that buy time but don't solve underlying problems. Greece, in the 2010s, provides a contemporary parallel. The country borrowed heavily based on optimistic assumptions about economic growth and revenue generation. When growth didn't materialize, debt burdens became unsustainable. Multiple restructurings and bailouts followed, each accompanied by promises of reform and return to growth. But without addressing fundamental issues: tax collection, pension obligations, productive capacity, the debt remained unsustainable regardless of how it was restructured. Spain faced the same dynamic for centuries earlier. The silver fleets were supposed to provide unlimited revenue. They didn't. Wars were supposed to deliver territorial gains that would pay for themselves. They didn't. Each bankruptcy restructured obligations without addressing why revenues couldn't cover expenses. The pattern could only end one way. The lesson isn't that government debt is always dangerous. Virtually every successful modern economy uses sovereign debt productively. The lesson is that debt must be matched to productive capacity, that borrowing for investment differs from borrowing for consumption, and that financial engineering cannot substitute for fundamental economic strength. Spain borrowed to finance wars of choice, to maintain an aristocratic class exempt from taxation, to import goods it could no longer produce domestically. None of this created future capacity to service the debt. The silver was collateral, not productive capacity. When the silver fleets diminished, the illusion collapsed. Perhaps the most profound lesson is about the relationship between tolerance and prosperity. Spain's expulsion of Jews, Muslims, and later Moriscos wasn't just morally reprehensible, was economically suicidal. Innovation ecosystems require diversity of thought, cultural exchange, and openness to new ideas. The Dutch Republic thrived partly because it welcomed exiles from across Europe. Skilled workers, innovative thinkers, and entrepreneurial merchants fled religious persecution elsewhere and brought their talents to Amsterdam. Spain made the opposite choice, prioritizing religious and cultural purity over productive capacity. The economic consequences were entirely predictable. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Islamic Golden Age flourished when Baghdad and Cordoba were cosmopolitan centers, welcoming scholars from diverse backgrounds. It declined as religious orthodoxy tightened. The Venetian Republic prospered as a crossroads of Mediterranean trade, bringing together merchants from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities. Renaissance Florence benefited from the mixing of classical, Islamic, and Christian intellectual traditions. Silicon Valley's dominance in technology innovation correlates with its unusual diversity and openness to immigrants. The mechanism is straightforward. Innovation requires recombining ideas in novel ways. An idea recombination happens most readily when people from different backgrounds interact and exchange perspectives. Spain's ideological rigidity prevented this kind of creative mixing. The Inquisition enforced religious and intellectual conformity. Conversos and Moriscos lived under constant suspicion. Foreign ideas were viewed with hostility unless they reinforced existing orthodoxy. The result was intellectual stagnation during precisely the period when Northern Europe experienced revolutionary advances in science, philosophy, and economic thought. Spain produced great artists and mystics during this period: Del Greco, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, but it produced relatively few scientists, few technological innovators, few economic thinkers who could challenge failing assumptions. The institutional environment selected for religious devotion and artistic expression while selecting against empirical inquiry and heterodox thinking. There's a final comparison worth making. The Spanish hidalgo and the Dutch merchant represent two different visions of human flourishing, two different value systems that shaped historical trajectories. The hidalgo valued honor, military glory, religious devotion, and aristocratic status. The merchant valued productivity, trade, innovation, and wealth creation. Neither is inherently superior as a complete philosophy of life. Both offer legitimate visions of what matters. But when it came to building sustainable, prosperous societies in the early modern period, one system worked and the other didn't. History rendered a verdict, even if it's not a verdict, about ultimate human values. The hidalgo ideal had emerged from centuries of Reconquista warfare. In that context, military prowess and religious commitment were exactly the capabilities that mattered. A nobleman who could lead troops, inspire loyalty, and demonstrate courage served crucial social functions. The disdain for commerce made sense in a feudal economy where wealth derived from land and military success delivered land. But when the context shifted, when success required coordinating complex trade networks, managing financial instruments, and investing in productive capacity, the hidalgo ideal became dysfunctional. The values persisted because values always outlast the contexts that formed them. But persistence made adaptation impossible. The merchant ideal, by contrast, aligned well with the emerging economic reality. Productivity and innovation created wealth in ways that military conquest increasingly couldn't. Trade networks generated prosperity more reliably than territorial expansion. Financial sophistication enabled projects impossible through traditional means. The Dutch merchant wasn't necessarily more virtuous than the Spanish hidalgo. Both value systems had their moral blind spots and their moments of hypocrisy. But the merchant values created incentives that pushed toward institutional development's property rights, contract enforcement, political accountability that enabled sustained prosperity. The hidalgo values created incentives that pushed toward different institutional development's military capacity, religious conformity, aristocratic privilege that served different goals. In the economic competition of the 17th century, one set of institutions outperformed the other decisively. Spain's tragedy was not that it lacked wealth, but that it lacked wisdom. The silver was never the problem. The problem was what they believed about the silver, that it represented permanent advantage rather than temporary windfall, that it obviated the need for institutional development, that it could substitute for productive capacity. These beliefs were psychologically understandable. They were culturally reinforced. They were institutionally embedded, and they were catastrophically wrong. This raises a final question for us. Watching this history from our own moment of historical change and economic uncertainty, what are our modern equivalents? What do we mistake for wealth that might actually be undermining our foundations? Is it financial engineering divorced from productive investment? Is it resource extraction justified by short-term revenue needs? Is it institutional arrangements that benefit current elites at the expense of long-term sustainability? Is it cultural narratives that prevent us from seeing clearly how the world is changing? Consider some contemporary parallels. Advanced economies have increasingly shifted toward financial services and away from manufacturing, under the assumption that finance represents higher value-added activity. But if finance becomes disconnected from productive investment, it's primarily about generating fees from trading existing assets rather than funding new productive capacities. It resembles Spain's silver, wealth that flows through the economy without building future capacity. Similarly, resource-rich nations continue to struggle with the same institutional challenges Spain faced. The temptation to rely on commodity revenues rather than building broad-based productive capacity remains powerful. Political systems designed around distributing resource rents rather than fostering innovation continue to underperform, or consider cultural rigidity and ideological purity. Spain expelled people who didn't fit religious orthodoxy. Modern societies face analogous pressures around ideological conformity, though the substance differs. When institutions punish heterodox thinking, when diversity of perspective is viewed as threat rather than asset, when orthodoxy matters more than innovation, these are warning signs. They suggest a society prioritizing internal cohesion over adaptive capacity, choosing comfort over challenge, preferring familiar failure to unfamiliar success. Spain made those choices repeatedly. The consequences took generations to fully manifest, but manifest they did. Today, Potosi is a poisoned mountain. Centuries of mining have contaminated the soil and water. The city that once held hundreds of thousands now struggles with poverty and environmental degradation. The silver is gone, extracted, and scattered across the globe. What remains in Spain from this entire experience? Architecture, certainly. Art and literature. The Spanish language spread across continents. Cultural contributions to world civilization, but not power, not economic dominance, not the capacity to shape global affairs. The Spanish galleon at the bottom of the Caribbean, surrounded by scattered coins that no one can spend, teaches us something essential about the nature of wealth and power. True wealth isn't metal or currency, its productive capacity, institutional quality, human capital, and social trust. True power isn't control over resources, it's the ability to adapt, innovate, and build systems that serve collective flourishing across generations. Spain had the appearance of both, but the reality of neither. And in the end, reality always asserts itself, no matter how much silver you have to argue otherwise.